Leviticus chapter 23. Welcome back. Just a warning, Papa John can't help himself. This is one of the chapters of Leviticus that was not part of the Come Follow Me curriculum. I've skipped a number of chapters, but this one, I can't help myself. I have to go through it. I hope you'll come along on the ride with me. Leviticus chapter 23, we're going to talk about the Creator's time clock. And most of us are unaware that the Creator's time clock, the, the hands of the clock were destroyed and completely replaced. Like everything else in life, it seems like the adversary is adamant to make sure we don't know the Creator or his times. But this chapter is a huge chapter for having a majority of the information regarding the God's calendar and his feasts and festivals. Even our LDS scholar, he says, chapter 23, he teaches us about the feast of the Jewish calendar. Well, in yellow, you'll notice that Papa John says, no, they are the feast of the Lord in all capitals. So that means they are the feast of Yahovah. And you'll see that as we go through this chapter together. Halverson then says, we already saw the Day of Atonement and how they were supposed to worship that day and with the various rituals they participated in. This chapter includes Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, but adds others as well. And then Keith Johnson, our Methodist minister, says, I'm excited about this chapter. I was in Israel for the first time to meet with Nehemiah Gordon. So chapter 23 has always been extremely special, but the reason is because of the invitation to Israel, which I don't mind talking about it, but it really came through revelation, through a dream. And then I knew I was to be there. And Papa John's just going to pause right there. I have to tell you the story. Keith Johnson, um, he basically was, I think, defensive or offensive coach somehow in the coaching team for the Seattle Seahawks. Very active, a man, had converted in his late or early 20s, I believe, to Christianity, became a Methodist minister. He's kind of, he's very open with his faith in football. No matter, everyone knows Keith and his faith in the Lord. But he feels this need to go to Jerusalem on this specific date. He doesn't even know why. And he ends up buying a Torah scroll that was smuggled out of Kuwait when America was trying to capture Saddam Hussein with the Kuwait conflict. And during that time, I guess these Torah scrolls and other things, contraband, had been smuggled out of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, or who knows. But somehow Keith Johnson ends up buying a Torah scroll, and he had met with Nehemiah, the scholar. He had been referred to him by a friend who played professional football. Um, I'll go into that with another episode. But when they met, he goes, I bought a Torah scroll. I need you to come check it out. And Nehemiah's thinking, well, you probably bought a little Chinese toy Torah from the souvenir shop. He was shocked to see it was an actual Torah scroll from some synagogue somewhere. And then the story continues from there. But I wanted you to have that background. When they open the Torah scroll, we'll get to that part of the story, and that's why I paused right there. So Keith continues, I really didn't know about the significance of the Lord's appointed times, or Shavuot. I knew about sacred times in the Methodist tradition, which is based on the life of Jesus. Two important feasts was Christmas and Easter, and in between, in certain things that happen, we've got Pentecost, which is the birth of the church, and we've got the Ascension. But basically, time was based on those two events in Christianity. And when I got to Leviticus chapter 23, which I didn't even know about, Leviticus 23, until I met Nehemiah, and it really changed everything. So I just returned from Israel doing a project on time and what's called Rediscovering God's Clock from the Land of Israel. And within that project, I got a chance to really dig deep to understand why this chapter is so important in the Bible and why the creator of the universe has got this clock. So that's the backdrop of Leviticus chapter 23 for me, Keith says. And verse 1 basically says it, and our LDS scholar will take us through it, Jared Halverson. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, but wait, the Lord is in all capitals, and Papa John has restored the Hebrew name, the divine name, and highlighted it in turquoise. So the verse should read, and Jehovah spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feast of, whose feast? The Lord, the Jehovah's, which he shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feast. And then Halverson adds, then throughout the chapter, he lists them. We don't see here all the specific things we're supposed to do on each holiday. These are scattered elsewhere throughout Scripture, and there's lots of great places online where you can study each of those. Now, since he mentioned online study helps, this is one I like to follow. A Rude Awakening is from our Bible scholar Michael Rood, and he's the one that wrote the book that changed my life that I was reading about the four Gospels. And we'll get to that in the New Testament. But the biblical calendar, and they wait for the observable events from Jerusalem itself, uh, which is God's navel. Wherever the Ark of the Covenant is considered God's name. He placed his name there. So the navel of the earth is Jerusalem, based on Scripture. And so the calendar is based on observable celestial observations and based upon agricultural events. Just it's quite fascinating, and it's taken me years to even know what we're looking at here. That crescent moon, that is the sighting of the new moon from Jerusalem. That would be the beginning of a new month. Did I know that? No. I was always looking for the full moon. I didn't know any better. And Deborah's date tree, I don't have a Facebook page, but she is one of the resources they use for the sighting of the new moon each month from Jerusalem. And there's so many fascinating stories there. But back to chapter 23 of Leviticus. Um, Verse 2, Jono Vandor from Australia. And uh, actually, let's skip to Keith Johnson. This is important. Jehovah said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my, and then my version says, my appointed feast. Jono, what does yours say? And Jonah says, speak to the children of Israel, say to them, the feast of Jehovah, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. These are my, and it skips, it doesn't say appointed, my feast. There's a blank there. Keith Johnson says, it doesn't say appointed. Jono says, no. He says, really? Okay, good. I don't think he means that, but he's verified that. So Nehemiah, could you read it in Hebrew for us? And oh my goodness, I won't make you suffer through Papa John. I've got it. Devar el B'nai Israel. Anyway, it goes on. Keith Johnson says, now before you translate that, I bet most people that if they hear that and you say it slowly one more time, I bet a lot of people who are listening, even though they don't know Hebrew, are going to have heard this. So say it one more time, nice and slow. Verse 2. So Nehemiah reads it again, and then Keith says, oh boy, Moadai, Moadai. So there's the word he was looking for, and Nehemiah is now going to go into this with a lot of Hebrew insights. Hang on, fasten your seatbelts. This is going to make your head spin. Moadai. So the key word is Moadai, which is a form of the word Moadim. And Moadim they are appointed times. It's the same word used in Genesis 1:14. So, hey, Nehemiah is taking us back to the creation. In Genesis 1:14, where it says that God created the sun and the moon for, among other things, Moadim, for the appointed times. Then we have in Psalms 104, I believe, where it says, Va'asa Ya'ar Ech Lemo Adim. He created the moon for the appointed time. So we've got Moed in the singular and Moedim is the plural. And we use the word feast, or Jono's translation uses the word feast. But if you want to be more specific, Hebrew has two words. One is Moed, or plural Moedim, appointed times with the S. The other word is Hag. Hag is a word that you see more often translated as feast. Hag is a more specific term among the Moedim. You only have three Hag, and three that are Hagim. Hag and Hagim is a term translated as feast, but more specifically, it's a pilgrimage feast. And Papa John's, just to interrupt here, Christ kept all three pilgrimage feasts. He complied completely with Scripture, with God's law, with the Torah. That's why he was perfect. He was actually, by the end of his life, the walking and breathing embodiment of total compliance of, of, of the Torah, of God's laws. That's why he could intercede for each of us, because none of us can make that claim. So he was not guilty of the death penalty of the oath made with God at Mount Sinai. All right, Papa John's gone off on a tangent. Back to Nehemiah. First, he says, I'll do a quick rundown on what the feasts are and on appointed times. I'm going to read the whole passage. So first, all we've got is Shabbat, or Sabbath. By the way, there's another term which is Mikra Kodesh. That was also in the passage we read. Mikra Kodesh is usually translated as holy convocations, which is really interesting because the word convocation, in English at least, implies that there's a gathering. But in Hebrew, it doesn't necessarily mean that. It can mean that, but it also means a holy proclamation. That's another translation of that actually makes sense. You could legitimately read this as, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the appointed times of Yehovah, which you shall proclaim them as holy proclamations. These are my appointed times. So he continues, what you are to do to the holy convocations is not to convocate on them, but to proclaim them. That is, to proclaim them to be days of proclamation, that you proclaim them to be holy. So, first of all, we have Shabbat, the Sabbath, which is you work 6 days and you rest on the seventh. I think that's a pretty self explanatory for most people. And then you've got the Hag HaMazot, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. A lot of people confuse that with Passover, because in later Hebrew, we refer to the whole feast as Passover. But in the Tanakh, or in the Torah, specifically the Old Testament, throughout the Hebrew Bible, Chag HaMatzot is the name of the holiday, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And Pesach is the name of the sacrifice offered during that feast. That's 7 days and then 7 days more. Um, if you, I'm just trying not to repeat so much. So the first and seventh day of the 7 days of unleavened bread are days of rest. And then there's those 7 days you've got the day of the waving of the Omer. And then you count 50 days. And you know what? Right now, Papa John's counting the Omer, and we're at day 27 on our way to 50. And just to interrupt once again, just close your eyes and listen. When you have the Passover, and then I believe the day after Passover begins the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So there's 7 days of that. And then, but you begin counting the Omer at some point in there. It's still confusing to me. And you count to 50. Well, actually, you count to 49. You count 7 Sabbaths. So, that's it comes to a total of 49 days. And then on the 50th day, that becomes the uh, day of Shavuot. Um, and in Christianity, we call it the day of Pentecost. So Nehemiah is trying to describe that to you. Then we have the 50 days of the counting of the Omer. The 50th day then is the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost in Keith's Methodist tradition, or in Christianity. In Hebrew, is called the Chag HaShavuot, or simply Shavuot, the Feast of Shavuot. And here's the word Chag, which again implies a pilgrimage feast. It also has two other names in the Torah, and we're just there's a Chag HaZer, the Feast of Harvest, and the other is Yom HaBikurim, the Day of First Fruits. Yes, I think our heads are spinning. Don't give up on me. Now, this is something I see a lot, Nehemiah says, in the Hebrew roots movement, where they confuse the day of first fruits, and they think that it's the day of the waving of the Omer, but the day of the waving of the Omer is during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The 50-day counted from that is called Yom HaBikurim, the day of first fruits, the feast of Shavuot, or the feast of the harvest. And then the third feast is in the 7th month, along with 2 other days. I think we're totally ignorant to God's calendar. Wouldn't you agree in Christianity? And maybe that matters, maybe it doesn't. I'll let you decide by the end of this episode. But then we've got Yom Teruah, which is called Zikron Teruah, which is the day of Teruah. Really, I would translate it, he says, as noise making, but it could also mean sometimes it's called trumpeting or shouting. So a day of shouting or a day of trumpets. And also it could be translated as memorial shouting or to be a mentioning shout. Some people explain Yom Teruah as a meaning the day of mentioning the name of Yehovah, mentioning God's name because it's from the word Zikron. And with Yom Kippur, we call it Yom Kippur in common speech, but it's actually called the Yom Kippurim, the Day of Atonement. And that's the 10th day of the 7th month. And then we have the Feast of Booths and the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, um, the Feast of Ingathering, and that's another 7-day feast. I think God wanted us to all be party animals, but in a good way. Boy, could they throw a feast, not just one day. Um, but what's interesting about everything he's saying in here is, hey, we always understand the weekly Sabbath, right? And to us, it's Sunday in Christianity, which is maybe not biblical. And I think I've talked about that back during the creation epic story and how the day was changed and why, and how the Catholics still claim authority over the Protestant movement and any Christian who practices the Sabbath on the Sunday, which day is not supported in Scripture. And that's quoting the Catholics. Uh, so just for your information, for food for thought, it's okay. God meets us where we're at, and it's okay to worship God every day of the week, right? But the Sabbath, as far as God's calendar, has not changed. But what's really interesting, what I began to say was, you can have multiple Sabbaths in one week. Why? Because the first day of these feasts and the last day of the feast are considered high Sabbaths, high holy days. So you could actually have more than one Sabbath in a week. And wait till we get to the New Testament when Christ, the year that he was crucified, there was actually not only a high Sabbath between the weekly Sabbath, but there was a 13th month that year. I hope that blows your mind. It definitely blew mine. Back to what Nehemiah is trying to explain for us here. Notice how verse 2 and 4 are almost identical word for word. And the reason it is, this is something we've seen before. It's called resumptive repetition. It's when scriptures go on a tangent. Then when it returns from the tangent, it repeats the last thing and says that it said before the tangent. So verse 2 starts off and he says, okay, now I'm going to tell you about the Moedim, and you shall proclaim them as holy proclamations. And then he talks about Shabbat, or the Sabbath. And then in verse 4, he goes back and says, these are the Moedim of Yehovah, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in these appointed times. So why does verse 4 repeat verse 2? The reason is, Nehemiah says, because verse 3 is a tangent. It was a tangent, and that was inserted there because of its association. Jonah Vandor says, we've highlighted those things before in previous Torah portions so far. Nehemiah says, he takes it right back from Jonah. He's not done. He says, well, so here's an example of a principle of association. Okay, we're talking about the holy proclamations. I'm just going to quickly mention Shabbat, the Sabbath, and then I'm going to go back to Moedim. And that's why verse 4, he actually repeats himself word for word almost again. And that's because they become the bookmarks. To cut to the chase, verse 4 and verse 2 are bookends, I should say, bookends for verse 3, which is the point, the little story that he went off on a tangent and then came back on. So he goes on a tangent about how people don't understand that the Sabbath, the Shabbat, is not based on the moon. It's a perpetual cycle that goes clear back to creation. It's been kept by the Jewish people perpetually as an unbroken 7-day cycle going back. And that's why you have in every language of the world, or hundreds of languages of the world, who all have the 7th day of the week. Well, in English, it's called Saturday, which is the day of Saturn. the pagan god, Saturn, the Roman god, Saturn. We're going back to Constantine. But in most languages, it's not called Saturday. Like in Spanish, it's Sabato. In Hebrew, it's called Yom Aha Shabbat. It's it's not it has nothing to do with Saturn. And so he's just helping us understand, hey, God's calendar, for many people, they're totally unaware of it. And Papa John was definitely one of those. Now, we're skipping a lot, but we're going to continue because there's more to get to. Jonah Vandor, after all of that, says, Keith, do you reckon he's a little riled up about that? What do you think? And Keith says, okay, okay. So only one simple thing that I wanted to bring up in chapter 23 was this idea that he says, these are my appointed feasts. So the word appointed, the thing that was so interesting to me was that when I was invited, the only word I heard in my dream, basically he's talking about, that said, come to Jerusalem for Shavuot. He goes, what I heard was, I've not changed my appointment with you. But I was not studying the Hebrew. I didn't know about the Moedim. I didn't know. And that communication to me was that there was an appointment. And this idea of that there was an appointment. So addressing that issue that Nehemiah just talked about and what you brought up, Jono, regarding those who are going by the lunar Sabbath or whatever. Think of this. Keith Johnson says, if the creator of the universe has an appointment book, and his appointment book is written, and it says in his appointment book, meet with my people on this day, why wouldn't we want to do it? So basically, the thing that, more than anything, that I wanted to say, and we did an overview of chapter 23 in a previous Torah portion, but these are actually in they're in his appointment book. They're actually on the calendar in the throne room. In the throne room, maybe it says, oh, I've got an appointment with my people on this day. But then we, the people down here below, are saying, well, that's not convenient. That doesn't work for us. We want to use a different calendar. And that's why I've been focusing on this idea of time, because I think there's a lot of people who are listening that know about the lunar calendar and they know about the Moedim. But there are a lot of others who we're reaching that have no idea what we're talking about. They just want to know, well, what do you mean? Do you mean to say that God actually has a calendar? And the answer is yes. And guess what? It's not the Gregorian calendar. It's not based on the Edict of Pontifex Maximus. It's not based on Pope Gregory. This calendar, God's calendar, is set. It's hardwired into the earth and into the rotation. And you can see it. In fact, I want to tell you guys, just as people are going and listening to this, there's a chance for people to actually look up in the sky and see God's clock. And so that's why I've been focusing on this. It's been 10 years on this issue of Leviticus 23, and this chapter is just important because it lays out so clearly when these appointments are and how we're to meet with him with a capital H. So that's my long and short of it. He says, Jono then says, and you were surprised, I'm not letting you off, Keith, when you asked about my book and that my translation that didn't mention appointed times. And it's an interesting thing, as you were talking, I just glanced over in my study Bible of the New King James Study Bible here, and it says in regards to verse 2, these instructions were for all the people. So this is a footnote in his Bible, and not just for the priest, but the feast of the Lord, literally meaning appointed times of the Lord. And Jonah says, I mean, if you have the information, why not just put it in the verse for Pete's sake? Okay. So then the study note goes on to say this phrase emphasizing these words, past tense. These were. No, these are holy days. Let me correct it, Jonah says. They are his specific appointed holy days. There's nothing about the past tense. And that's evident in the Hebrew and totally whitewashed and sanitized out of Scripture in the English. Whenever I read the word appointed times and seasons, I always thought it was talking about in Scripture about the four seasons spring, summer, fall, and winter. There's so much more to it than that. I'm having a blast. And if your head's spinning, I apologize. Let's just continue. Keith says, I believe it's in verse 15. There's an idea of actually counting from the Feast of Unleavened Bread up until the time of Shavuot. And during this time for me, every year without fail, for the last 10 years, it's always been a very special time. And so for me, I've just been excited. It's a chance to count the times, to know where we're at, and to look forward. And then, of course, when Shavuot comes, we celebrate that also. And so when I met Nehemiah, I told him that I had a dream to be there in Jerusalem on Shavuot. And he said later to me that the thing that caught his attention, I think they were talking over the phone, but Nehemiah has a lot of people that reach out to him. Um, and so what caught his attention about Keith's comment was that he was talking about Shavuot and this pilgrimage feast, and that caught Nehemiah's attention. And he kept that appointment with Keith. And when he got his Torah scroll and they opened it up, it opened up. When they rolled the scroll open, there, right in the middle, was Leviticus chapter 23 on this particular section and verse 15. Nehemiah, I'd like you to read it in Hebrew for us. Um, and so Nehemiah does. I'm not going to slaughter and desecrate that sacred text with my attempt to read it. And then Keith Johnson says, and then I asked Nehemiah the question that you're all asking right now. What are you reading? And what did you say, Nehemiah? Nehemiah says, it translates, and you shall count for yourselves from the morrow of the Shabbat, from the day of the bringing of the Omer, of waving. And Omer is a word that means a sheaf. So the sheaf of waving, 7 complete Sabbaths, which totals 49. Until the morrow of the 7th Sabbath, you shall count 50 days. And what's interesting to Papa John is that the 50th day is always on a Sunday because they're counting 7 Sabbaths. And they land on the 49th day, which is the 7th Sabbath. And then the 50th day, which is always on a Sunday. To me, that's kind of odd because that's a Christian day for most of us. And yet that is the day of Shavuot, and it's always on a Sunday. Kind of cool. And you shall make a new offering, a mincha, which is a grain offering. You shall bring a new grain offering to Yehovah. There it is. Keith Johnson says, oh, okay. Nehemiah says, and I'm sitting here, I'm reading about the celebration of the holiday of Shavuot. Well, for me, this is the idea that there's an appointment and that I was here in Israel for that appointment. And I've got to be on the southern side of the temple celebrating on that actual day, though it was different than the rabbinical date and differs from the Christian Pentecost. So if you understand what he just said, the calendar that Keith and Nehemiah are going by is different from the rabbinical Jewish calendar that they created when they were sent into exile, and they were in exile, they were scattered throughout the world, and they couldn't observe the calendar from Jerusalem. So their calendar is kind of off, and then the Christian calendar is also off. So they're trying to restore the calendar, and they've done some amazing things. In fact, when Israel became a nation, it seemed to be a not so important day, the day they became a nation, until they restored the calendar and with the help of NASA went back in time with the reversed uh, rotations of the planets and the stars. They can do that. And you know what? It was a high holy day after all when Israel became a nation. Again, I'm getting way off on too many things. Keith Johnson basically ends by saying it's a really powerful thing to witness heaven and earth coming together in orchestration to let us know when the appointments are, the appointments with God. Jonah says, Amen. Let me read this. As Nehemiah removed the velvet cover, he remarked that it was indeed a genuine Torah scroll, a very old one at that. And I waited in anticipation as Nehemiah began to read from the scroll. What does it mean? I asked. It's the section of the feast in Leviticus 23, Nehemiah explained. I immediately picked up my Bible and turned to Leviticus 23 so that I could follow along. As Nehemiah read and translated, it dawned on me that the scroll had been opened to the section on Shavuot. I'm getting chills just as am reading Jonah as he reads the book that describes what happened. When Nehemiah reached the end of the section, I let out a loud shout of excitement and jumped for joy, clenching my Bible in my hands. And when I was done dancing with joy, I turned to Nehemiah, who had been startled by my vocal and physical expressions of enthusiasm, and said, Do you realize the significance of this? And I had been called to come to Jerusalem on Shavuot, and to get the Torah scroll, which everyone told me was impossible. And finally, I got the scroll. It's open to the section on Shavuot, to the section on Shavuot. And Nehemiah told me that he was impressed, but not sure what to make of it. Oh, dear me, I love this book. Nehemiah says, can we recreate that moment? I want to. Keith says, no, no, no. Here we are 10 years later, and who shouts more than me? Now, what he's doing is he's giving a dig at Nehemiah. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture. This is when Nehemiah and Keith Johnson met. And Nehemiah was this Bible nerd training for being raised by generations of rabbis, being trained and taught since he's 3 years old in Hebrew to be a rabbi. God had a different plan for him. Look at him now. Here he is getting married a few years ago. For the and look at there's Keith's Torah scroll between them as a witness to their marriage, which is quite beautiful. But Nehemiah, when they originally met, was so quiet, and he'd been raised to never express excitement or emotion. And that if you did while you're teaching, then your teaching is weak. Your arguments are weak because you're having to compensate with influxes of emotion to make your points. That's the way he was raised to think and to act. And so now, hanging out with Keith Johnson, Keith is saying, and who shouts more than me? And Nehemiah says, woohoo, come on. And we don't need to we don't need to recreate the moment, Keith Johnson says. So Nehemiah adds, so we're standing there in Jerusalem in this apartment, and I'm reading, and he goes to the Hebrew, and he finishes it, and then he turns to Keith. What does it say? And Keith, who's so excited and hooting and hollering and making noise, he says, I don't know what it's talking about. And I didn't know. But yet he was, Nehemiah says, and he's got his Bible and he's dancing. And I'm like, what the is going on? And Keith says, what is he doing? Keith says, at this very moment, after the reading of the Torah scroll, after the shouting, after the singing, I said, Nehemiah, you and I are going to be friends. And he said, no, we're not. And I said, Nehemiah, you're going to teach me to read the Torah scroll. And he says, no, I'm not. And we had an argument and we fought back and forth. And 10 years later now, here we are teaching from this around the world. People are hearing this around the world. And this is a really cool moment for me because I'm sitting here. I've got you, Jono, in Australia, Nehemiah in Israel. I'm here in the United States. We've opened up to the section that was opened first in the Torah scroll that's just around the corner from where I'm sitting right now. And that Torah scroll is a witness of what I believe in the Creator and what He's calling us now to do. That His Torah would go forth around the world and that people would understand it, attempt to live it, want to understand it, apply it in their lives. And now that's what we're doing. So 10 years later, here we're actually talking about this chapter so you got to understand why. For me, yes, I get a little excited. And Jono says it is exciting. And I wanted, just in case there's some people who don't know what you're talking about, the book is called A Prayer to Our Father. I just read a little bit of that, A Prayer to Our Father, Hebrew Origins of the Lord's Prayer by Nehemiah Gordon and Keith Johnson. It is the whole story. It's a riveting story. So for everybody who hasn't got this book, you've got to get it. I can't believe you haven't gotten it and you haven't listened to Torah Pearls. So get it quickly, he says. All right. We're only at verse 3. My apologies. Okay, let's get moving here. Our LDS scholar says, here's his list in chapter 23. Verse 3, he mentions the Sabbath of rest. So there's Shabbat. The Sabbath takes place every single week, the frequent ones, and then there's infrequent ones. So how come Jared Halverson knew there was more than one Sabbath within a week? Well, he did go to divinity school. Papa John's the last to know. Verse 4, Michael Rood, our Bible scholar, that you'll get to know more in the New Testament. He says in verse 4, we read of the holy convocations of the feast of the Lord, of Yehovah. In Ezekiel 20:20 and Exodus 31:13, it doesn't say Sabbath singular, it says Sabbaths in plural, and not just the weekly Sabbath, which are the foundations of the feast of the Lord, his weekly feast, the set apart time, his holy time, yet every feast begins with and ends with a high Sabbath in addition to the weekly Sabbath. So he's talking about all the feasts, and this is what draws at the hearts of the Gentiles. especially we in the Western Gentile world, because all we have are renamed pagan celebrations. We don't have any biblical feasts that we really celebrate. So when Gentiles find out about the feast of the Lord, more properly the feast of Yehovah, that these are his commanded times, when he says, I want you up at this place where I put my name, understand wherever he puts his name is where the Ark of the Covenant is. The place that was called by his name for 400 years was Shiloh, because that's where the Ark was, and it was called by his name. And then it went to Jerusalem, and every place that the ark is, that's the place that's called by his divine name, because that's where his personal presence is. And Papa John adds, this in part may also apply to our latter-day temples, especially when one begins to understand that engraved in gold on each temple are the words, holiness to the Lord, the house of the Lord, which in the original Hebrew language would not have read the Lord in all capitals. They would have written the personal Hebrew name of God the Father, Yehovah. His presence certainly can be found there in the temple. Holiness to Yehovah, the house of Yehovah. That's powerful. I wanted to create some artwork about, and I want to figure out how to do that. Maybe with the help of some artistic family members, we'll see what we can do with that someday. Verse 5, Jared Howerson, our LDS scholar, says, the Lord's Passover, the Pesach, the Passover that we study in the book of Exodus. Verse 6, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In Hebrew, that's called Mazot, which again is about the unleavened bread that they eat for the week following Passover. We're skipping through quite a few of these, but you'll see every time the highlighted name of God. After verse 10, our LDS scholar Jared says, verse 10 and 16 mention the first fruits of your harvest and 50 days. So there's Shavuot, which is the Feast of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks. That's the 50 days of the Feast of First Fruits, it's also called. Now I'm going to insert, Papa John couldn't help himself. Event 219, it is finished. The cry of triumph and the death of Yeshua. This is from the chronological Gospels. We're going to go through this with the New Testament. But just so you know, week 63, day 438, the 14th day of the month, the first month, the year 4028, Wednesday, April 28th, 28 CE. On that day, Christ offers himself as the Lamb without blemish. And he does it exactly to the time, the day, the hour, and to the minute when the paschal lamb was being sacrificed for the nation of Israel by the high priest. Because all day long they've been sacrificing the Passover lambs for every household. And at 3 p.m, this is when Christ offers himself, fulfilling the feast, the holy convocation, the holy rehearsal of good things to come that pointed towards that moment in time, missed by those in Jerusalem because of the calendar. Oh, let's just read my notes here. Verse 12 in the New Testament says, and ye shall offer that day when ye wave the sheaf on an he lamb without blemish of the first year for a burnt offering unto Yehovah. Papa John prophesied to the day, the hour, the exact moment. This is supported in verse 12 of a prophecy describing the future Messiah who will be offered as a he lamb of the first year without blemish. Interesting how there is no mention of any 3.5-year-old lamb or any 3.5-year ministry. The 3.5-year ministry of the Lord was produced in the imagination of Greek and Latin minded Catholics masquerading as so called Christians. Now that's a mouthful. There's a truth bomb. You'll have to digest that one when we get into the New Testament. And I'm open to correction through all of this, but these things have changed Papa John's life. Back to my footnote, with a little more study regarding the Feast of Yehovah, specifically this feast, which the date of cannot be known by the people of Israel, of the day or the hour until the first fall feast is announced. This, I believe, is a shadow and a type of how the second coming will play out, how again no one but the Father knows the day and the hour. Even with God's calendar, we are left dependent upon him as it is dependent on actual observable events month to month. A reminder that we truly are completely dependent on God for every breath and moment in time, in the time of our existence, even our heartbeat. We're dependent upon Him for minute to minute, heartbeat to heartbeat. Thereby the grace of God go I, says Papa John, as you may have heard that common phrase in Christianity. And then I have a note to myself, I need to complete more research and verify much of this information. Wow. Okay, back to Leviticus 23. We're going to skip 13, 14, 15, but notice the highlighted names of God, and even at times the title of God. Like right here in verse 22, I am Yehovah your Elohim. After verse 24 speaks of the memorial, a blowing of the trumpets. That's the Jewish New Year. You take these ram horns, Jared Halverson says, these shofars, and blow them, these trumpet blasts that send out the old year and invite in the new. In Hebrew, it's called Rosh Hashanah. Rosh means head, Shana means year, so Rosh Hashanah is the head of the year, the Jewish New Year. Skipping through a few more verses. Jared Halverson again after 27. Verse 27 is the Day of Atonement. So there's Yom Kippur, the Day of Covering, the Day of Atonement. We already studied that. And, uh, and then verses 34 and 39 talk about the Feast of Tabernacle, as well as the time that's gathered in the first fruit of the land. So there's Sukkot and the Feast of Tabernacles, also known as the Feast of Gathering, when they bring in that food. And then the chapter ends. Um, Beautiful highlighted restored names throughout the scriptures here. That's such a beautiful thing to Papa John. You'll notice italicized words here and there. Like let's go back up 35. On the first day, there shall be, that's a filler word. So it should have read, and the first day, an holy convocation. But the English King James translator added shall be. And then even where it ends, that therein, look for the italicized words and remember those are filler words. As we get down, I think there's a little more. Jared Halverson, this is great. Verse 44, Moses declared unto the children of Israel the feast of the Lord. And then Halverson says, now as Latter-day Saints, we don't do quite as much with the ritual calendar as other churches do. Whether it's reading the lectionary every week, in some ways the Come Follow Me has become our lectionary week by week as we study the scriptures. And I'm going to interrupt Jared Halverson. Papa John's life has been changed by the Come Follow Me curriculum. It has completely blown my mind the time I've taken, and now I can't wait to study the scriptures. It's no longer a burden to read the scriptures. And what's really amazing to me is we were promised when they rolled out the Come Follow Me curriculum that this would give us protection in the last days that we're living through, similar to when they painted the blood on the doorpost for the first Passover before they left Egypt. This is really powerful stuff that I hope we're not taking lightly. I hope my children and my children's children, extended family and friends, hear the power of what I'm saying. Reading the scriptures annually like the Hebrews do, and the lectioneers from the Catholic Church and the Protestants, and reading the scriptures with some type of annual study curriculum is important. And I'm grateful for it pushing me to record these Papa John episodes. Now, Jared Halverson basically finishes this footnote by saying, we have Christmas and Easter, of course. We have General Conference in April and October, and there's Pioneer Day, and there's times in our year that we remember things, but to think of the Jewish calendar. And Papa John in yellow says, no, Jehovah's calendar. But that's okay. God meets us where we're at, and Jared Halverson is a more knowledgeable scholar than myself. I just think I've been blessed by God to have met some very unique teachers in Nehemiah Gordon and Keith Johnson and Michael Rood and others. So that's what it's for. The, the calendar of Yehovah is the time to remember the incredible things God has given to them. Halverson says, well, Papa says that he's given to us. Let's make it first person in their past. No, it's ours. And it's not just the past. These are prophetic shadow pictures pointing to the future. And Halverson says that, but he keeps saying it's theirs and it's not ours. It's for the world because God created it, and it's in motion. Just look up in the sky. with trained eyes, and you'll know what to look for. So let me just stop interrupting myself and Jared Howerson. It's a time to remember the incredible things God has done for them or us in their past or ours, and it will yet do for them and us in the future. Ritual and calendar is shelf number one. We have proved him in days that are past, Halverson says, and I have all this evidence of the miraculous hand of God in my life, and so does Papa John. That's prepared me for shelf two, shelf three with blessings forthcoming. He's talking about the shelf of doubt. When you're studying things, you're not sure what to think, put it on the shelf. Don't throw it out. And that's what I did with a lot of this information. Even the name of God, the divine name, I kept saying, I'm not sure that's what we believe. I'm not sure that's what I've been taught. And I've realized there's actually allowance. When you have two Jews in one room, there's at least three opinions because we're working things out. We're working out our salvation in fear and trembling, actually in awe and wonder. But it's okay to have things on shelf one, two, or three, and move it from three to shelf two, and then shelf two to shelf one, and they can stay on the shelf. Or eventually, you got to just know this is too perfect. I'm going to swallow this. This is truth. This is going to become part of me. I'm taking it off the shelf. That's what Jared Halverson's talking about. Uh, there is sacred time. These calendars help us organize and order our lives around this. There's need to be flexibility and freedom and summer vacation, if you want to call it that, but there are also days and times and seasons and months and years that help us organize our lives and pattern it after the template of the temple of sacred times in sacred space. And Papa John ends today's episode by saying, my notes above are to personalize and to internalize the feast of Yahweh. Are we not gathering Israel after all? Thanks again. Wow, flying fast today. If you made it through the end of this episode, congratulations. Between now and the next episode, continue to be an example of the believers. Let these little tidbits of truth ponder on them. Let them distill within your heart. Man, can you understand why Papa John couldn't pass up this chapter? Well, anyway, between now and then, just live the gospel the best you know how. That's what I'm doing. And I look forward to the next episode, and I'll talk to you guys again soon.